Hello everybody, I'm Casey, and welcome to another edition of Let's Talk About. Today, let's talk about Gravity Falls. Yeah, you thought we were done with Gravity Falls, didn't you? But wouldn't you know it, I still have more to say on what I now consider my favorite show. And can you blame me? Gravity Falls is such an amazing show. The jokes, the mystery, the animation, the characters, the overall story, it truly is a top-notch program. But I only managed to review a handful of episodes before the show came to an end, and in the process, didn't really touch on something that is important to acknowledge about such a great show. That, of course, being the worst episodes. Okay, I can tell this is a subject you all feel very strongly about, but trust me, this is going somewhere. In my mind, there really isn't a bad episode of Gravity Falls, just some that aren't as good as others. And while I do still call Gravity Falls my favorite show, I do want to acknowledge that it's not perfect, and I know that. It has weak episodes like any other show, and today, now that I've marathoned the entire show for the first time, we'll be counting down my top 6 least favorite episodes of Gravity Falls. Be sure to keep in mind that this is just my opinion, and if you like any of these episodes, that's great. But why top 6? Because come on, there are so many good ones. You really expect me to pick 10? And as always, spoilers for everyone. Let's start off with number 6. Boss Mabel. Yeah, can you tell I'm stretching here? In all honesty, very little is wrong with the episode. It has a funny scenario on both sides of the story, with Mabel running the Mystery Shack and Stan competing on a game show, and there are some pretty funny moments. Not to mention this premise could probably only work on Gravity Falls. Since Stan is such a terrible caretaker at this point in the show, you don't even think of the fact that he left 2 kids alone for 3 days with no adult supervision. So why is it on the list? Honestly, it's just by default. To me, it's just not as interesting as most of the other episodes. In fact, when I try to think about all of the episodes, I often forget about this one. Not to mention the supernatural stuff is kinda put to the side to make room for Mabel's antics and conflict, despite featuring one of the most memorable creatures in the entire show. To me, it feels more like a filler episode than any other. A really good filler episode, but filler nonetheless. And considering that the show is only 40 episodes long, that's a bigger problem in hindsight. Again, it's by no means bad, but when compared to the rest of Season 1, it's just not as memorable, at least to me. I'll fully admit that I'm grasping at straws here, but this is the worst of the best, so you'll probably see some more nitpicking. Though I will give this episode credit for one thing. It actually got me to laugh at a barfing joke.
I'm feeling car sick.
That is hilarious. Number 5. Little Dipper. I really didn't think this one was going to be on the list, but when I was watching all the episodes in a row, I realized that this is a bit bland compared to the rest of Season 1, at least in the first 2/3. While I like the idea of the height-altering crystals, it's just not nearly as intriguing as some of the other supernatural occurrences in Gravity Falls. Like the last entry, it's not really bad, and in fact the climax in the Hall of Mirrors and the message are easily the best moments. It's just kind of underwhelming compared to the rest of the show. With the exception of realizing just what a psychopath Gideon was. Seriously, I know he got kinda sorta redeemed, but this kid seriously needs to talk to someone. Despite having some really good moments, this episode just didn't keep me invested or make me laugh as much as the other episodes did. Still nitpicking here, but now we're getting to the episodes I do have actual problems with. Number 4. Roadside Attraction. Now this is the only episode on this list that I've already reviewed, but I still think I should elaborate on why this episode is here now that I've had more time to think about it. The premise is by no means a bad one, but for me, I felt like the focus was in the wrong place. For one, while the antics of Stan sabotaging organs or other tourist traps and the attractions themselves are funny, I think the story suffers by taking so long to get to the Mystery Mountain. The supernatural threat for this episode is the owner of the Mystery Mountain, Darlene, who turns out to be a half-spider lady who wants to eat Stan.
1, I don't want to see him in that suit. 2, I don't want to see him fly. And 3, he's got to fight a giant spider in the 3rd act.
Given that Stan has been telling Dipper how to attract women only to fall for those same tricks himself is really clever. The problem for me is that I don't think we spend enough time here for this to be as strong a message as it could have been. A lot of supernatural threats on Gravity Falls don't come in until the 3rd act, but they have a constant presence. The idea of the half-spider creatures isn't even mentioned until right before we meet Darlene, halfway through the episode. It just doesn't seem to build up the suspense. This might not have been as big an issue for me if this was somewhere in season 1, but this is right before the biggest event in the entire series, and this was the last self-contained adventure we'd have with the Pines family. I know the main focus is Dipper trying to flirt with a lot of girls only to have that mindset backfire on him, and again, I think that's a good idea, but I think there could have been a way to structure this better so these events could take place at the Mystery Mountain and have Stan's subplot with Darlene happen simultaneously. It's still a fine enough story, but this was the only episode of Gravity Falls I found myself trying to rewrite. That's how much I like this idea. I wanted to see it brought out to its full potential, and considering where Dipper and Stan were personally at this point in the show, it could have been great. But instead, we're left with just a lukewarm episode. But it did give me the chance to use that great Kevin Smith clip. What the heck, play it again.
So I'm sitting in the theater watching the movie, I'm like, good lord, this is a piece of shit. But then all of a sudden, like a giant fucking spider shows up.
Number 3. The Love God. This is the only other episode from season 2 I'm not a huge fan of, even though it has a lot going for it. I just didn't find Mabel trying to help Robbie move on and the conflict caused between Wendy and her friends because of her matchmaking antics very interesting. I mean, the rest of season 2 up to this point had been so hilarious and suspenseful and mysterious that this just felt kind of mediocre by comparison. I'm also not a huge fan of the Love God himself. I just found him kind of loud and obnoxious. I realized that was kind of the point, but unlike, say, Manly Dan, I never found it particularly funny. I just found him so annoying, so it was kind of tough for me to take him seriously when he's trying to warn Mabel about misusing love magic. And for a long time, I wasn't a fan of how they handled the love magic. I really wasn't sure how to feel about Dipper and Mabel's choice to not break the spell they put on Robbie and Tambry. I've heard people say it's a lesson in knowing when to stop meddling in other people's lives, and while that is a good idea, I'm not sure it came across the way they wanted it to. Still, the journal did go more into this, so it doesn't bother me as much as it used to. But unlike Roadside Attraction, this episode has some hilarious and memorable moments as well, like the reveal of Robbie's parents and Stan's balloon, which may be one of the funniest scenes in the entire show. There are some really good things in this episode, but the negatives were so strong to me, it just wasn't enough to make me fall in love with it. Number 2. Boys Crazy. Gravity Falls doesn't seem to have that one universally hated episode. This show doesn't have a Great Divide or a Spike at Your Service or even a Love and Monsters, but when I hear people talk about their least favorite episodes, this one seems to come up a lot. The only way I can think to describe this episode is weird. This is a really weird episode, and not really an intriguing weird like the rest of the show, which is a shame because, like the other entries so far, it does have a lot going for it. Just the concept of the boy band being manufactured clones is a really clever commentary on the attitude of the music industry in the past couple of decades. I'd like to think this is getting better, but we're not quite out of this mindset yet. Anyway, an intriguing idea, but then it devolves into Mabel and the others trying to tame them like animals because their manager was keeping them in a cage and never letting them go outside. It's just so bizarre, and I think this episode moved away from what could have been an interesting commentary into what seems like a commentary on animal rights? For some reason. Then there's Dipper's plot with Stan to find a hypnotizing message in a song Robbie played for Wendy. Man, this just makes it look like I hate the Dipper and Stan stories, but I really don't. In fact, their scenes together are the highlight of the episode. The reason I bring this plot up is because of what drives it. Where did this CD come from? It's hinted that it's some kind of spell that Robbie found, but where the heck did he get it? I can't imagine where Robbie of all people would have gotten his hands on this thing, and nobody else, not even Dipper, seems to question where it came from. A minor gripe, but something that leaves me scratching my head every time I see it. Like I said, there are some interesting ideas and fun interactions, including some great lines from Stan.
Finally a good reason to punch a teenager in the face!
But everything else is just so bizarre, even by Gravity Falls standards, that it's really distracting. And my number 1 least favorite episode of Gravity Falls is Dipper versus Manliness. I'm sorry, I know a lot of people really like this episode, I just don't. Yeah, this is the only episode I can say I really don't like. It's definitely the one I've seen the least. There's certainly not a bad message or anything offensive about it, it just doesn't appeal to me personally. With the plots just being Dipper trying to be more manly and Mabel trying to clean Stan up to set him up with Lazy Susan, I just wasn't really invested. And I really wasn't a fan of the Manitors. Like with the Love God, I just found them loud and obnoxious rather than funny. Except now there's like 20 of them. They certainly had their moments.
I smell emotional issues.
But it wasn't nearly enough for me. I get what they were going for, and the message, at least on Dipper's end, is by no means a bad one, but for me, it was just boring and gross and not a whole lot of fun. I just don't get how this got the green light when there were story ideas so much more interesting that didn't make the cut. There was a scrapped idea for Wendy and Stan to become jewel thieves, and we get this. There was a scrapped idea for an old friend of Stan's to be a biker with Ghost Rider-esque demon powers, and we get this. I was so unimpressed with this episode when it came out that it actually made me question if the great episodes before it were just a fluke, and if this is where the show was headed. Thankfully it wasn't, but that doesn't stop this from being my least favorite episode of Gravity Falls. But even with all that, I still don't think it's a bad episode. Because I stand by that there are no bad episodes. Even at its weakest, Gravity Falls was ambitious, creative, and funny. I'll fully admit that watching Dipper vs. Manliness again, it's not as bad as I remember it being. The opening scene in the diner may be one of my favorite showcases of the townsfolk in the whole series. It pushed the limits, and while there were a few duds, the rest of the show more than made up for it. And to prove that, next time, to celebrate 1 year as a YouTube reviewer, I'll be counting down my top 12 favorite episodes of Gravity Falls. Until then, thanks for watching, and I will see you guys next time.